my leader and my more senior member. I do have an amendment in the nature substitute for mine. I don't know if you can pass that up.
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to go.
I'm glad to set the context if you'd like. Glad to set the context if you'd like. Of course, this arises directly out of events in Charlottesville and comes out of the Task Force on Public Safety Preparedness in response to civil unrest, which was established pursuant to Executive Order 68, right after the events in Charlottesville. And this task force, which was comprised of local and state government experts, law enforcement, attorneys, first responders, and others, considered a number of recommendations, and they were very worried, I think, about.
Yes, sir.
Please join us.
I'm listening.
They were very concerned about the ability to control weaponry that could be used within a perimeter of a demonstration. And so what they came up with was a notion that a locality could, by ordinance, put certain prohibitions against weapons being carried into a designated permitted area for a demonstration. If you saw what happened in Charlottesville, I know most of you did, you would realize that so many more people were injured because of the access to weaponry. And frankly, we probably were very lucky that people weren't shot, because there are a number of people there with guns. There was one person who did discharge a firearm into the ground. There were other weapons there too, and we, I think, were very lucky. This would enable localities to control these demonstrations in a way to make it less likely for this kind of incident to occur again. We have people from the Attorney General's office here, as well as people from the city of Charlottesville to testify for the bill. Delegate Watson, Delegate Levine have a little bit different bills than mine. I don't want to presume to be able to tell you what's in their bills, but I think the arguments are pretty similar.
And I will just add the perspective from my bill, while not exactly the way I would have worded it, the perspective that I had in coming forward with a bill, and I seldom do this, but for 40 years my husband did the legal work for the National Park Service, and within his office was a separate legal office for National Capital Area Parks. So therefore I became aware over the 40 years in a number of different instances about the challenges in each unique demonstration that occurs around the National Mall, and all of the various means that one might use to make sure that you have proper crowd control and yet not infringe upon the right of free speech and assembly. And with that, what immediately concerned me from a distance about what happened at Charlottesville, that I was concerned that in our focus that there be uniformity throughout the state, that we were not allowing local law enforcement to use their judgment about what was happening as one dealt with the group that was asking for the permit, and what possible conditions you might have, which would include timing and location and perimeters and all of those sorts of things. That I also felt that law enforcement needed to be able to use their judgment that for that particular demonstration, that they could ban the use of firearms at that demonstration. It's rare that we come to have to define all weapons, so that we're saying no picket signs as well, but I knew that that was not necessarily something that was controlled by state law. That judgment call could be made that you couldn't have a stick, but we can't make, I was concerned that we couldn't make the judgment call that you wouldn't be able to have a firearm within a given perimeter because of the nature of the demonstration.
I don't think we voted on your substitute yet.
Okay, so I'd like to ask to move the
I don't think
substitute
we
if I
got
could.
it before, so I need a motion to move substitute.
Second.
Okay. All in say aye.
Aye.
The substitute properly before it's done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Of course, the events in Charlottesville horrified, I would say, the entire nation and the world. They certainly scared my constituents in Alexandria. They saw a bunch of really hateful people who said terrible things about blacks and Jews and others march into Charlottesville with AK-47s, and frankly, the police were outgunned. In Alexandria, we have a Confederate memorial. We also have the leader of the protest in Charlottesville lives a mile from my home, Richard Spencer. And my constituents are very, very nervous that he's going to do in Alexandria what he did in Charlottesville. So I spent a lot of time talking with the chief of police of Alexandria. And we talked about the fact that under this law, the police are outgunned. That an army of people can come in, and I don't know whether we need National Guard and helicopters, the whole U.S. military, but people really fear, and my police really fear a crossfire, really fear that the people were very, very angry with each other in Charlottesville, and all kinds of people were armed and fearing a little war in our streets. And I do thank God that only Heather Heyer was murdered. It's terrible she was murdered, but I thank God it actually wasn't worse. I know that in rural communities, a lot of folks need their firearms. They know that the police sometimes can be 30 minutes away. They know that they need them for self-defense. I understand that argument. In a permit situation, in a protest situation, the police are right there. They are literally surrounding the place. They are the ones who want to control the situation. So I went around to look for laws that about firearms and protests. I know that I've done protests in Washington, D.C., and I had a sign on a stick, and I had to take it off the stick because you don't allow even a wooden stick in Washington, D.C. They're that strict, much less firearms. But I went around to find a state that had a similar law. And I wasn't going to look for Massachusetts. I wasn't going to look for Rhode Island. I found Alabama. I actually have Alabama's law here if y'all want to see it. I'll pass it out. This is Alabama, section 13A, 1159. You can pass it out. Alabama is stricter, actually, than the law that I propose, the bill that I propose. Alabama simply bans all firearms at demonstrations. It has it right here. It's unlawful for any person other than a law enforcement officer to have them at demonstrations. My bill is permissive. It allows a locality, if they so choose, at any particular permit, at any particular event, if they so choose, to, in their discretion, do what they need to do. And the rest of it largely copies the Alabama law. It also has exceptions, as Alabama does. Obviously, a law enforcement officer, a member of the National Guard, a member of the Armed Forces, can have their weapons within the perimeter, performing their lawful duties. It also requires signs so that everybody knows what's allowed and what's not allowed. We don't want anyone to be surprised here. So I largely copied the Alabama law, and I put it here thinking that while my bill, and it's rare that anyone's going to say that Delegate Levine is more conservative than Alabama. I understand that. But actually, my bill is more conservative than Alabama's because Alabama prohibits it for all events, and mine, like Delegate Toscano's, and I think like Delegate Watts, allows a locality to ban it if they want to on a case-by-case basis, understanding that, you know, hundreds of people descending on Charlottesville may be very different from 3 or 4 people marching in the streets. So I would ask that this committee seriously consider these bills. Our citizens are scared, frankly, and our police are demanding these things as a way to control the situation. And the police are there, and they can do a better job. Frankly, I think one of the reasons why if you read that very long 200-page report in Charlottesville, why the police didn't do as good a job, frankly, as they could have, is because they were largely outgunned. And so this actually helps our law enforcement control the situation as they do in Alabama. Thank you.
Any questions from any member of the committee?
Mr. Chairman,
Delegate
this might be for council or for Delegate Toscano. I noticed on 1019 it doesn't have the same provision that would allow for members of the armed forces or National Guard in the performance of their duties. The other 2 bills do. Is there a reason why in 1019 we didn't have that? Because it only basically applies to, as I'm reading it, law enforcement.
Well, it allows the locality to determine prohibition. The other bill did provide an exemption for law enforcement officers, and one would expect that the locality would do the same in their ordinance. On that, I defer to the AG, to the Secretary of Public Safety.
Mr. I guess what I'm really looking at is if we look at lines 23, 24, nothing in this section on 23 shall prohibit a law enforcement officer as defined, the scope of their duties, but in the other ones, it's broader and includes National Guard armed forces, which I think is a good provision, which may be supporting some public events.
I don't know why it's not.
I don't know why it's not in there either. I didn't draft the bill, so I was assuming it was whoever drafted the request.
It's in mine.
If you're thinking about acting favorably on the bill, we'll put it in.
Friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment.
All right, they'll just vote on the block or do it.
You might as well do it individually.
First of all, any, want to speak in favor of the ordinance?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Brian
I
Rance.
said delegate, I meant secretary.
Motion. I did have the opportunity to serve on this committee for 1 year, so I can't say I particularly enjoyed it, but I did have the opportunity to serve. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is really a new issue. I know you've been dealing with some issues today that come up perennially, and you hear the arguments, but you know, what happened in Charlottesville does deserve some attention in terms of what steps can we take and this legislature take to make sure that never happens again. And after having observed it personally, and then afterwards, the governor asked me to chair a task force of diverse stakeholders. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the former chair of this committee, Scott Lingenfelter, served on that committee, as well as Senator Bryce Reeves. Certainly two Second Amendment members of the legislature. We worked on these issues with law enforcement, and we took a look at Charlottesville, not so much what happened there, but what can we learn and take away from it so that we can prevent something like that occurring again. And we spent a great deal of time, how do we limit or how to ensure First Amendment rights, but at the same time ensuring public safety. Ultimately, that was the intersection of what happened out there when you had literally thousands of individuals come. And many came with firearms. So we, to make sure we balance Second Amendment rights with First Amendment rights, we asked a constitutional scholar, it was taught law at constitutional law at University of Richmond, and now he's up in Delaware, but he provided advice to that committee. And because of the Heller decision, Heller recognized special events. And in fact, that was applied in the George Mason case when George Mason University banned firearms on their campus. And they relied on the Heller case to support that decision by George Mason. You can do that, therefore, at an event such as what happened in Charlottesville and others, as long as you have a robust permitting process. And that's something that the task force developed guidelines to encourage all localities to have a rigorous, robust permitting process that observes First Amendment rights, but at the same time you can place reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner. And banning firearms is indeed a reasonable restriction. Because what happened in Charlottesville, you can see by these pictures, and these firearms that came in early in the morning, semi-automatic weapons, frankly chilled First Amendment rights. There were people that did not want to come to that park when you had the presence of these types of weapons. And then there were concealed weapons. And for a long time there, we were thankful that nobody actually shot any firearms. But about 2 weeks after the event, the ACLU released a video, and we actually observed that a man did indeed shoot a firearm, discharge a firearm in that park, and he's being prosecuted for it. Again, it's an example of, indeed, there was public safety risks at that park. And what we would encourage localities to do is institute robust, rigorous permitting process, and that's why Delegate Toscano's requires a permitting process. And then we give it to the localities to allow them to ban firearms at such a demonstration. So, you know, this is a fairly new issue for you all. I do hope you give it favorable consideration, because there's no doubt in my mind, after having observed personally what happened out in Charlottesville, we need to equip our localities and our law enforcement with the ability to ban those firearms. And let me continue for a moment. Let me speak to what happened in Richmond. Robert E. Lee Monument. Now that happens to be state land. So we were able to ban firearms from Robert E. Lee on Monument Avenue. And why shouldn't localities have the same authority? You know, why shouldn't the city of Charlottesville, the city of Alexandria have the same authority to do what we did at the Robert E. Lee Monument? So, I don't want to belabor the point, but this is, I think it's truly, it's a new issue. I know you've considered a lot of the previous issues, but this is one, it's going to happen again. No doubt in my mind, something of this nature will occur again. We want to provide our authorities, particularly our law enforcement, with every opportunity. They can ban weapons now, but not firearms. Try to tell that to a constituent. I heard them in Richmond say, well, what, you can ban firearms, you can ban weapons, but not firearms? It doesn't make any sense. So, again, I hope you, I haven't had the opportunity, the benefit to read all of Delegate Watts or Delegate Levine's, but they certainly articulated the very same point. So it sounds like they have really good legislation as well. We're particularly interested in Delegate Toscano. So thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anyone else to speak in favor? Yes, sir.
My name is Robert Stewart McAdams Sr. I'm a resident of Albemarle County, and I'm representing the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice. And I speak as someone who was in the downtown area of Charlottesville all day on August the 12th. Now, after the KKK rally that occurred in Charlottesville on July 8th, members of the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice feared that violence would occur at the much larger white supremacist rally planned for August 12th. Among our recommendations to the Charlottesville City Council was the request that the city establish a safety zone surrounding and including Emancipation Park, within which all weapons would be prohibited. We were later told by a city councilor that the city could not legally establish the safety zone we recommended. In consideration of the events of August 11th and 12th, our board and members see a great need for every municipality to have the legal authority to establish safety zones for events that pose a risk of violence. These safety zones would be limited to the specific locations and times related to the events. And within those safety zones, all weapons would be prohibited. We've got three compelling reasons that argue for this. Excluding weapons from potentially violent events will reduce the risk of bodily harm for every participant, including law enforcement officers. Number two, on the night of August 11th, white supremacists and neo-Nazis with torches marched through the University of Virginia grounds. They assaulted students trying to protect a statue of Thomas Jefferson. And they threatened clergy and community members attending an interfaith worship service. As those marchers mimicked the terrorism of Nazis in Germany during the 1930s, they were asserting the dominance of mob rule, their rule, over civil authority. On August 12th, confident in their numbers and armament, the white supremacists, fascists, and neo-Nazis and others again asserted their hateful dominance of mob rule over civil authority. Given the legal authority to establish weapons-free safety zones, municipalities like Charlottesville could clearly assert the dominance of civil authority over mob rule before, during, and after such an event. Enforcing a prohibition against weapons of any kind would maintain public order and safety without infringing on anyone's right to peaceful assembly or free speech. Weapons are not necessary for speech. In fact, mob rule destroys free speech. Number 3, establishing safety zones for specific events, times, and locations would give municipalities a basic operational structure for maintaining public order and safety. Within that structure, municipalities would be able to set and publish rules for the event well in advance. They could develop strategies, standard procedures, training, and also prepare needed equipment to enforce the weapons prohibition and maintain control of the event from start to finish. The board and members of the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice therefore urge you as delegates to the General Assembly to enact this legislation, to empower municipalities to establish weapons-free safety zones for specific events, times, and locations. The need for this authority is urgent. The organizations that brought mayhem to Charlottesville in August have promised to return. Those same organizations are planning events in other localities throughout Virginia. Every municipality needs this authority. We ask for your support of these bills. Thank you. Here's a printed copy for the clerk.
I'm Lisa Robertson. I'm the Deputy City Attorney for the City of Charlottesville. I spoke earlier. This is Lieutenant Brian O'Donnell, who is here today as a representative of the city's Chief of Police. Our City Council and our citizens, we're speaking for them today, and we very much wish to support Delegate Toscano's bill. We appreciate that he has been willing to sponsor that and bring that forward. As I've listened here today, I think it's fairly safe to say that if this committee were of the inclination to support any one of these bills that's in front of you, our City Council would be grateful for that support. That being said, Lieutenant O'Donnell and I sat through a Senate committee last week in which bills that had similar wording were discussed, and I understand that there are likely a number of you who have similar concerns over wording. I think that as I listen here today, I think back to a conversation I had with the city's Chief of Police after last week's Senate hearings. I said, you know, if we couldn't get the bill we were asking for, what would you want? In your opinion, what would be most helpful to you? And the chief indicated that if you could put a number of these bills together, and if you could propose a scenario in which your law enforcement agency could establish a secure perimeter around an event after a determination that they didn't have the ability to adequately protect the public without one, you'd have a bill in which the police department could say to everyone entering that event, there are certain things you can't bring in here because we need it to be a safe zone for people to exercise their First Amendment rights in a safe fashion. There are a number of federal court cases that have upheld the concept of free speech zones and safety zones. From a First Amendment perspective, they're easily defensible. One example I found of a law that allows that sort of thing is in the state of Tennessee. Like Virginia, Tennessee is a Dillon's Rule jurisdiction. They are hesitant to allow any delegation of firearms regulations to localities. But last year, they enacted new legislation that would allow, in connection with an outdoor assembly, for a police agency to set up a secure perimeter. They don't have to deal with measuring distances, that sort of thing. They would have to physically set up a perimeter and control access to the event through a security checkpoint. If any of you have ever been to a University of Virginia football game, it's the concept of security that you have to go through to get into the football game. It's not difficult to administer, but it's a tool that, when necessary, would help our police department control a situation in which a lot of people are in close quarters, and it would greatly enhance public safety. So if we're asking one thing today, it's that you support our delegates' bill, but if you can't do that, if there is any amendment of that bill or a combination of the bills that are in front of you that you all could support as a law enforcement tool, a public safety measure, to allow for a specific safety zone that's physically cordoned off, entry is controlled, signs are posted at the entrance telling people exactly what they can and can't bring into the area, and the restrictions are of a very specific, limited, reasonable duration that only lasts for the time period of an event. We know that those limited measures exercised within well-defined parameters would enhance our police department's ability to make plans to effectively manage and protect people assembled in that type of situation. So I'm making a special appeal to you today. I know that several of you aren't inclined to consider any of these things, but if you could look at it a little differently and consider it as a law enforcement tool, what we're asking you to consider is in fact a new idea, and one that I don't think that this General Assembly has considered previously as a law enforcement measure. But I can tell you that our police chief has floated that idea with the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police and with some other law enforcement agencies in urban jurisdictions, and there is some measure for support of that. If you could, if any of you could consider an amendment that would allow at least one of these bills to move forward to a full committee and take one step forward, I and our police department as well as our local government would be grateful for that.
Thank you for your comments.
And I would add, sir, if I may.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we have to be
Please
cautious.
give your name.
Yes, sir. Brian O'Donnell. I'm a lieutenant with the Charlottesville Police Department. I think it's important that people are cautious with the argument that because there were so many guns there downtown and no one was shot, that somehow it was a less dangerous situation. It wasn't. We were about a half a heartbeat away from a firefight in downtown Charlottesville. And we need some type of legislation to protect the citizens, protesters, the police from that in the future. And I would ask you to consider it.
Thank you. Does anyone else speak in favor?
Mr. Chairman, Andrew Goddard, Virginia Centre for Public Safety. We believe that public order and public safety is best handled by trained professionals such as the police or the National Guard, and not be left to armed mobs, even if they're wearing uniforms and carrying semi-automatic weapons.
Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Taylor with the City of Alexandria on behalf of the City Council. We're here in support of Delegate Levine's bill and the concept of giving localities the authority to regulate firearms at demonstrations as they see fit. This may not be the right choice for many communities in Virginia, but we believe that this is the right choice for us, and we're asking you to give us the authority to do that in our community. Thank you.
Okay, let me make it clear that this is for bills 814, 1019, and 1052. Either one of the ones you want to speak on is fine.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Jonathan Romans, Richmond, Virginia. When I heard about these bills, particularly 814, I'm a gun violence prevention advocate, and I've had plenty of experience in public protests in Richmond and in Virginia, and I have plenty of experience with interacting with Virginia gun owners. And I had prepared a speech half an hour long to relay to you. I listened to this testimonies from these other people. I want the testimonies that you hear to have more weight than I do. So I'm gonna give you one incident. My first public experience in Richmond at a prayer vigil for gun violence prevention. It was December 14th, 2013. Members of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America was holding a prayer vigil at Maymont Park to remember the first year anniversary of the Newtown tragedy. When I arrived there, I saw them over, I believe the statue's the bell tower, but there's a giant statue there and they're all huddled around it. And around them was a perimeter of gun owners, guys marching around with guns. And I cut through them and joined the prayer vigil, enjoyed the prayer vigil. And afterwards I looked at these guys and I could recognize what group they were with by the militiamen on their cap. That's all I want to say about it. But I introduced myself to these ladies, and they admitted they were scared of approaching me because they thought I was one of them infiltrating their prayer vigil. They thought I was, a gun owner come to infiltrate their prayer vigil. I was like, has this happened before? And they said, yes, it's happened before in years past on Martin Luther King Day when they have a prayer vigil right on the state capitol grounds. They formed a circle right around unarmed gun violence prevention advocates, people who are trying to stop gun violence. Whether or not you agree with it, these guys use their guns, not for self-defense, but for intimidating others because they knew that their guns would bring fear into these people. So to support these bills, yes, I do.
Anyone else like to speak in favor or raise their hand? Support. Okay. Would you like to speak, ma'am?
Yes, I'm Brittany Anderson on behalf of the Attorney General's office. We'd like to say sorry also for the comments before you today. We do feel like this is a law enforcement tool and that localities should be given the discretion to decide what's best to keep their community safe.
Okay, anyone like to speak in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Kopacki, National Rifle Association. As we discussed previously, some of these bills really go against the firearm preemption here in Virginia, which protects people from accidentally becoming criminals due to a patchwork of laws that they may not be familiar with while they're traveling around. In addition, looking at some of the language in these bills, I think some comments were previously made or brought up that specific distances, let's say the event was going through Monument Avenue, you could potentially be a criminal by simply walking out of your front door and going into your car. So for some of these reasons that we posted them.
Okay, including DCDLs, when you count the ways. We have a rally out at the Bell Tower. In theory, then everybody in this building would be disarmed. Interesting. Anytime I hear law enforcement needing a tool, I know that tool is going to come out of my liberties. And indeed, that's what we're talking about here. My right to self-defense is critical. I don't want to have to depend on somebody else to save my life because they may decide they've got other priorities. Richmond, by the way, the state controlled the grass around the statue. It didn't control anything else. They were only banning guns on the grass. There were people there with guns. The difference was the Richmond police decided to not stand down and enforce the laws. They arrested people wearing masks and everything else. They did it right. Charlottesville had everybody standing down and they did it wrong, and here we are. VCDL has rallies. So that means if we have a rally somewhere now, in theory, the locality can say, well, fine, you're a gun organization, tough, no guns at your rally. So then we have to give our Second Amendment rights to have our First Amendment rights. So, if one of these things turns violent, I would rather be able to protect myself and survive it than be there helpless. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Bob Sapper, South Richmond. I despise Unite the Right as much as anybody, and I certainly extend my sympathies to Delegate Levine having to live so close to a flaming idiot. I hope it doesn't lower his property values. But
Sure it does.
I wouldn't be surprised. But, Mr. Chairman, what I'm about to say is going to make me the most unpopular man in the room. So be it.
Think about it.
Think
about it before you say it. Just stick to the bills.
I called Philip after the mess, disgusting, ugly mess in Charlottesville, and we had a discussion. I am proud of the gun owners in Charlottesville that day. All but one. Very proud. They were shouted at, they were cursed at, spit on. In fact, one conservative blogger was blinded with acid. Everybody kept their cool and did not engage, except for one individual Mr. Toscano mentioned, and what he didn't mention is he was menaced by an Antifa thug with a homemade flamethrower. That, if you want to show the picture, that the flame is in the picture. I think this sets a bad precedent. And there's one elephant in the room that nobody's willing to talk about. When you have a permitted event, the locality has complete freedom to set staging areas, boundaries, You can keep these groups apart. It's happened between us and gun control advocates numerous times. We have our staging area, they have theirs. If someone had not decided to get cute and declare a state of emergency, voiding the permits, these two groups would probably not have been shoved together in the first place. And all the violence just might have been avoided. Thank you.
Anyone else like to speak in opposition or raise your hand? Okay, thank you very much. Any comment from the committee?
Let me say one last
Yes,
thing,
sure.
before we get to the votes.
I'll give you all one.
I won't take long. One of the things I found interesting, let me say this. The scariest thing a citizen of the United States can hear from their local police is, "I'm sorry, we can't protect you." That's a really scary thing to hear. We're gonna try, but we can't promise we'll protect you. In Charlottesville, the Unite the Right, whoever they are, neo-Nazis, have tried to protest again. And Charlottesville quite recently says, we can't protect our citizens, so we don't want you to speak. And they canceled the rally. Now there's a whole lawsuit about their First Amendment rights. If we cannot set up secure perimeters, we're gonna start harming basic free speech in America. Because if the police can't protect us, then it's actually reasonable to start banning free speech. To say, hey, we'd rather you not die, so we're gonna stop the rallies. And that would be fundamentally anti-American, to try to shut down free speech. So, you know, I'm happy to add flamethrowers to my list of weapons, but people should be arguing in a battle of ideas and not the battle of weapons. And again, if Alabama can do it, I really think Virginia can. That's all I have to say.
Any more comments? If not, go for a block vote or a piece bill.
Do it one by one.
Okay, all right, the first one would be, Levine's bill 814. I have a motion.
Move to report.
Substitute motion, Mr. Chairman, move to PDI.
Second.
Got a substitute motion, PDI, and second. Those in favor, vote on the voting machines. Motion PDI passes 3-2. The next deal is, Delegate Toscano, 1019.
Second, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I would like to make, if it were in proper order here, but amendment where we put in the language about the armed forces, because I think, it's not compliant with the bills.
We haven't had a request from the patron.
If it would make a difference, I would entertain, but my waste of time, it's gonna be PBI.
Substitute motion, Mr. Chairman, PDI.
Mr. Chairman, before, I asked when Mr. O'Donnell.
I'm gonna second first, then we'll have discussion. With the motion first.
I'd like to discuss and ask some questions before I make my decision on the bill, Mr. Chairman.
We've got a motion, right now, GBI. Time to have discussions, when we have a motion properly before us, it's been made and seconded, then the discussion will take place.
Point of order?
I asked when Mr. O'Donnell was here to speak, I asked to ask him a question, and you told me that.
Okay, all right, I didn't realize that, I remember now.
Correct. Mr. O'Donnell, may I ask Mr.
Okay.
O'Donnell a question?
First, I'd like for, Delegate Freitas to withdraw his motion.
I withdraw my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate, Firearms.
Mr. O'Donnell, we heard some testimony, about what happened in Charlottesville, and since Mr. Toscano's bill is probably more related and comes from what happened at the Charlottesville event. On August the 11th, when the events had happened on August the 11th, could not those demonstrators been controlled and arrested for their actions?
I wasn't out that night, and they were on university property. which is outside our jurisdiction. We have a mutual aid agreement. And how that worked that night, I don't know because I was not there for that.
Any other questions?
That's it.
Any other questions?
Motion PBI, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Motion PBI, House Bill 1019, it's been seconded. Cast your vote on the resolution. Motion PBI passes 3-2. The next bill is. Third time's the charm. Bill 1052. I have a motion.
PBI.
Motion to PBI, second. All those in favor vote, all vote. Motion PBI carries 3-2.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.